The man known to history as John F. Kennedy was born on 29th of May, 1917, at his family's home in Brookline, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was a prominent businessman with interests in property, banking, finance, and the motion picture industry. His mother, Rose Fitzgerald, was a socialite and philanthropist. The highly intelligent and college-educated daughter of the congressman and twice-elected mayor of Boston, John "Honey" Fitzgerald. Rose became a homemaker and a full-time parent after her marriage, as many middle-class and upper-class American women did during the early 20th century. But as her husband achieved greater and greater financial success over time, her role as housekeeper gradually reverted to a supervisory one. Joseph and Rose Kennedy had 9 children, 5 daughters and 4 sons, of whom John, known affectionately within the family as Jack, was the second. Jack had complicated relationships with his older brother Joseph, known as Joe Jr., as well as with their father. Joe Sear and Joe Jr. were much alike, ambitious, athletic, confident. They both loved Jack, and he loved his father and brother, both of whom gave him their attention and care. But Jack had little in common with either of them as a child. Where they were outspoken and outgoing, always dominating family dinner conversations, Jack was quiet and introspective. He had much more in common with his mother, Rose. Like his mother, Jack was intensely curious, a deep thinker, and a voracious reader from an early age. Rose Kennedy had shown far more academic aptitude and achievement during her high school and college years than her husband had. Rose graduated third from a high school class of nearly 300 students, and Jack seemed to have inherited her more intellectual and cerebral qualities. As a child, Rose recalled, her second son struck her as a daydreamer, even a romantic. It seemed to her that during any conversation or while performing any task, Jack was only half present while his other half was wandering somewhere no one else could follow. Perhaps it was because Joe Jr. idolized and emulated their father so much, or because Joe Sr. was so assiduous in cultivating a spirit of competitiveness within and among his children, that Jack sought to distinguish himself from his older brother. That may also explain why Joe Jr. and Jack fought with one another so frequently in childhood, and why they proved to be so intensely competitive with each other later in life. Their father's constant emphasis on the all-importance of winning, of success, was something that all of Joe Sr.'s younger children absorbed as well. While it likely made for difficult growing pains among the Kennedy children, almost all nonetheless grew up to be extraordinarily successful people. 7 more Kennedy children followed Jack over the next decade. Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward. Of all his siblings, Jack was closest in his youth to his sister Kathleen, whom the family called Kick, although Jack and Bobby, who were much further apart in age, became much closer in their young adulthood. The birth of Rosemary, just 16 months after Jack, no doubt gave him a classic middle child complex. Rosemary Kennedy was born with what is believed to have been an intellectual disability as a result of brain damage sustained from a critical lack of oxygen during her birth. By the age of 2, it was apparent that she was not developing cognitive or motor skills at the expected rate, with Rose's attention firmly focused on his younger sister and with Joe Jr. being their father's obvious favorite. Jack became an increasingly self-contained and independent child. When he learned to read, he positively lost himself in books. He enjoyed histories and biographies, from which tales of great civilizations and heroic deeds inspired him. He particularly loved to read and reread the tales of King Arthur, his Knights of the Round Table, and the legendary Camelot. Rose Kennedy was a devout Catholic, and she wanted her children raised and educated as such. The Kennedys attended Mass regularly at St. Aidan's Church in Brookline and observed daily prayers at home together as a family. Rose ensured that all of the Kennedy children carried rosaries and all underwent confirmation in the church once they reached adolescence. The eldest Kennedy children attended the nearby Edward Devotional School during their elementary school years. Both Joseph and Rose were the grandchildren of Irish immigrants. Though the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds had moved up significantly in the world since the mid-19th century, anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment continued to permeate Boston, especially at the highest social and economic echelons. Joe Sr.'s father, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, and Rose's father, John F. Fitzgerald, for whom Jack was named, had both achieved success in local politics and business despite the pervasive discrimination against Irish Catholics and their own fairly humble beginnings. P.J. Kennedy even did well enough to send his son Joseph to Harvard. Though both of their families had achieved a great deal of success in just 2 generations, Joe Sr. grew weary of the persistent "No Irish Need Apply" signs, which continued to marginalize Boston's Irish population for housing and jobs, while also barring them from social clubs and events reserved for elite white Protestants. When Jack was 10 years old, Joe, Sr. and Rose moved the family from Brookline, Massachusetts, to the New York City borough known as the Bronx. The move to New York was also partly in response to a shift in Joe Sr.'s business activities. It allowed him to be closer to Wall St., thus facilitating the greater ease of managing his finance and property concerns. He began to make regular business trips to Los Angeles as well, where he had purchased several failing film companies and amalgamated them into the highly successful RKO Pictures. Joseph and Rose Kennedy were both traditionalists to whom family was all important. But their marriage was in no way perfect. Joe Sr. regularly had extramarital affairs throughout much of their life together. Because divorce was frowned upon at best and was especially taboo for Catholics, Rose was forced to find her own ways of coping with her husband's unfaithfulness. Joe Sr. often had affairs with women he met in his professional life, such as secretaries and actresses. He carried on an affair for some years with the celebrated actress Gloria Swanson, whom he even invited home to visit his family. One can only imagine the grace and dignity Rose had to call upon in order to behave as a warm and welcoming hostess to her husband's mistress. Throughout her marriage to Joseph Kennedy, Rose regularly took short vacations by herself, often with her sisters or a few close friends. These trips likely provided some respite from the demands of her increasingly visible public position as Mrs. Joseph Kennedy, as well as being the mother of 9 children, the oldest of whom was barely into his mid-teens. Despite her husband's constant womanizing, Rose Kennedy remained stoic. She never outwardly acknowledged Joseph's philandering or spoke of the pain it undoubtedly gave her. The fact that Joseph Kennedy was an active and engaged husband and father, when he was present, may have provided some salve to the sting of his infidelities. The Kennedys did not allow their children to be lazy and dream away their weekends or school vacations. Joe Sr. and Rose always had a full itinerary of family activities during holidays. Sometimes they went to the theater or to parties, but many neighbors and friends of the Kennedys who lived near their summer retreat at Hyannisport, Massachusetts, recalled that the family stayed home together more often than not. This was not, they said, because their neighbors refused to invite them, but because the family genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Importantly, family time was treated as an opportunity for teaching and parenting. Whether it was football, golf, sailing, swimming, or after-dinner charades, the Kennedys treated every activity as intensely adversarial, as an opportunity for glory. "We want no losers in this family," Joe Sr. once told his children, "only winners." Achieving second or third place meant nothing. Weekend visitors to the family's Hyannisport estate joked that even touch football was a bloody affair when one played with the Kennedys. As well as high academic and career achievement, Joseph and Rose Kennedy stressed the importance of one's personal contribution to society, a notion which seems jarring set against the backdrop of extraordinary economic privilege, of which the Kennedys, as one of the wealthiest families in the United States by the mid-20th century, are a prime example. Joe Sr. amassed enormous wealth throughout the course of his career, and each of his children inherited a trust fund which guaranteed them a fabulously luxurious lifestyle regardless of the careers they chose. Nonetheless, it is clear that all of the Kennedy children absorbed their parents' early lessons of the importance of being a force for good in society, for most of them went on to have impressive and consequential careers in public service. Jack's health was always delicate, even as a child. Though he was athletic and strong as his father and elder brother Joe encouraged and coached him to be, Jack was always underweight and had frequent digestive problems, colds, and bacterial or viral infections. He suffered through scarlet fever, chicken pox, whooping cough, and measles all before the age of 10. He averaged about 2 lengthy hospital stays per year throughout his youth for one mysterious ailment or another. Whether it was infections, hives, jaundice, terrible stomach pains, or dramatic weight loss. He had been misdiagnosed with various illnesses ranging from blood disorders to leukemia. Eventually, his doctors would discover that ulcerative colitis was at least partly responsible for his constant digestive problems. In his late 20s, an English doctor finally diagnosed him with Addison's disease, an endocrine disorder. Recent medical literature posits that Kennedy's condition may have contributed to a general failure of his autoimmune function, with wide-ranging impacts on his overall health. Stoic like his mother, Jack learned early on to quietly cope with pain and illness. His toughness manifested itself in the development of a dark, fatalistic sense of humor. Rather than complain or lapse into depression, he made fun of himself and his situation. His letters to family and friends during his many periods of convalescence describe embarrassing and painful examinations by an endless parade of doctors, which Jack painted in hilarious and often crude terms. Self-deprecation was his defense against those who might pity him. While he was away at boarding school in Canterbury, Massachusetts, in the spring of 1931, Jack suffered the pain of appendicitis for nearly 2 days before finally being hospitalized for an appendectomy. His parents brought him home to New York for the last 2 months of the school year to recover. In the autumn, Jack was sent to Choate, a Connecticut preparatory academy that was a well-known feeder school for the Ivy League. Joseph Kennedy had acquiesced to his wife's insistence that their children attend Catholic parochial schools for their elementary education, but insisted that his sons, at least, should attend public secular institutions for secondary school and college. Well aware of the anti-Catholic feeling that still permeated American institutions and ambitious that his sons might launch successful political careers, Joseph Kennedy was adamant that Joe Jr. and Jack attend schools which the white Protestant elite viewed as prestigious. The Kennedy daughters, however, all received their secondary educations at Catholic convent schools. At Choate, Jack's childhood fascination with tales of great civilizations and heroic figures began to mature into a lifelong interest in history, politics, and government. Kennedy's biographers disagree about the extent to which a career in politics was what Jack really wanted. He and his brother Joe Jr. certainly experienced pressure from their father to achieve such ambitions. Jack's more recent biographers believe that for him, however, the interest in government and statecraft was both his own and genuine. Jack was not a particularly good student, at least not in the ways his parents and his teachers expected him to be. He was always late. He was invariably sloppy, often showing up to class in rumpled clothes and odd socks, his school tie askew. His roommate and his housemaster both complained that his room was always a disastrous mess. To top it all off, Jack's sense of humor was far too irreverent to please the authority figures around him. Throughout his academic career at Choate, Jack achieved no more than a C average. All this, however, seemed to be no yardstick of the young man's ability or promise. Joe Jr., who was 2 years ahead of Jack at Choate, achieved much better grades than his younger brother. He was a star athlete and had a much better behavior record. However, Jack's teachers perceived his natural intelligence and intuited that he might be an outstanding student if only he would apply himself. He was blessed with the ability to read a text and to grasp and contextualize all of its implications quickly. His memory was first-rate, and his powers of recall from a single reading were impressive. He had a highly developed and artful vocabulary for his age, and despite his poor spelling and poor use of punctuation, he was an excellent writer. He was exceptionally creative and imaginative in ways his brother was not, Jack's instructors noted. He was especially adept at English and history, both subjects which interested him enough that he achieved grades in the upper 70s and low 80s. Unlike his scores in maths, sciences, or foreign languages, subjects in which he usually scored in the mid-60s. Though he was hardly Choate's most impressive scholar, he was nonetheless well-liked by his fellow students and even most of his teachers. What most of his peers remembered about Jack was his charm and affability. Handsome and charismatic with a winning smile and a quick wit, even the faculty and school staff couldn't help but like him, even though he could be a handful. As an insecure young man, just outgrowing his shyness and trying to stand out from his accomplished older brother, their father's favorite, Jack became something of a rebel. A psychologist whom Jack saw briefly during his Choate years believed that Jack failed to work hard because the thought of competing with his brother and failing was too much to face. One of the many benefits Jack gained from attending Choate was the opportunity to come out of his shell, as well as his brother's shadow. Far from continuing to be the quiet and isolated bookworm he had been in childhood, he soon made a tight circle of friends. One of them was his roommate, Lem Billings, with whom Jack remained friends all his life. Jack and his school chums called themselves the Muckers Club. The name was coined by the school's headmaster, who had given the whole student body a dressing down for the latest practical joke Jack and his pals had dreamed up. Holding up a broken toilet seat which had evidently been exploded with a firecracker, the headmaster warned them that he would find the muckers that had so brazenly disrespected their school. On another occasion, the Muckers Club had stolen a life-size cardboard cutout of the film star Mae West from a local movie theater and put it in their housemaster's bed. The group even had lapel pins made with an engraving of a shovel and the initials CMC, or Choate Muckers Club, engraved on them. The boys came very close to expulsion in their second year, a threat that was rescinded once their headmaster had calmed down. Jack successfully completed his studies at Choate in the summer of 1935. Though he graduated in the middle of his class, his fellow students voted him most likely to succeed. Though his high school grades had been less than impressive, Jack did quite well on his college entrance exams to Harvard and Princeton, earning scores in the 80s for both tests. He gained admission to both universities for the 1935-1936 school year and happily selected Princeton, since a number of his school friends from Choate, including Lem Billings, were starting there in September as well. Joseph Kennedy intended for Jack to first spend a semester studying under Harold Lasky at the London School of Economics, as his brother Joe Jr. had. But Jack's continuing ill health brought him back to the States within a month. He managed to enroll late at Princeton, but even this was too much for him, and he was once again hospitalized just 2 months later. Since returning in the middle of the school year was not an option. Once Jack recovered, Joseph Kennedy decided to send his son to Europe. Jack spent the late spring and the whole summer wandering through Europe, experiencing what is now called a gap year, before beginning his first year of college. In the autumn of 1936, Jack began his studies at Harvard, his father's alma mater, as Joseph Kennedy had hoped he would. During his first few years at Harvard, Jack hardly seemed to take his studies and academic record more seriously than he had at Choate. A gentleman's C average, which had also been characteristic of Joseph Kennedy's own performance when he attended Harvard, seemed to be good enough for Jack. During his early college years, he seemed far more interested in the sports and social opportunities offered at the college. He joined football and swim teams. He had a close-knit group of friends at Harvard, some of them from his Choate days, and they often went to movies and parties together. Jack also developed his well-known reputation with women during these years. Though he rarely had a steady girlfriend, Jack's handsomeness, charisma, and intelligence ensured that he always had a date for every social occasion. Like his father, Jack developed a reputation for inveterate skirt chasing and many affairs, behavior which Joe Sr. approved and encouraged in his letters to his young son. However, Jack's reputation with women was really only prevalent among people in the know and did not become public knowledge until the decades following his death. Jack's latter years at Harvard were far more productive and impressive. His senior thesis, entitled Appeasement in Munich, was highly regarded by his professors, and he made the dean's list in his senior year. He later reworked his thesis into a book which he published commercially under the title Why England Slept, which became an instant bestseller and attracted significant critical acclaim. It was one of the first and most thorough explanations available to the public of English political developments in the 1930s, which had led the nation into World War II. This impressive turnabout in Jack's academic achievement was no doubt due to a change in his educational environment. During 1938 and 1939, Jack was in Europe for several stretches of 3 or more months, watching the very events he chronicled in his thesis unfold. The entire Kennedy family spent time in London when Joseph Kennedy was named the U.S. ambassador to the court of St. James. The Kennedys were very well received in London, quickly becoming part of the elite political and social scene and regularly making headlines. Their eldest daughters, Rosemary, Kathleen, and Eunice, all made their debut before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Kik and Eunice worked for the Red Cross, though the rest of the Kennedys were content to return to the U.S. Kik absolutely fell in love with London and decided to make her home there after her father resigned his position as ambassador. In 1944, she married William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, who, sadly, was killed in battle 4 months later. As a result of Joe Sr.'s appointment as ambassador, Jack's classroom for much of his last 2 years of college was Europe's political stage on the eve of the Second World War. He had the chance to attend and observe the political process in England and to meet and get to know parliamentarians that he had only ever read about. Most meaningful to Jack was the opportunity to meet and spend time with Winston Churchill, whom he greatly admired for his literary and statecraft achievements. Jack traveled extensively throughout Europe and the Middle East on a fact-finding mission for his father, even crossing the German lines into Czechoslovakia to assess the situation in Prague. The authorities at the American embassy there were less than pleased at having to shepherd this rich man's son through extremely dangerous territory for a mission that seemed little more important than a bureaucratic internship. Yet, when they met Jack and had a chance to speak to him about his investigations across the continent, they softened, as many who expected haughty self-importance from a Kennedy tended to do. Jack was fast becoming a serious young man where politics and international affairs were concerned, and his handlers had to admit he was producing reports worthy of an experienced diplomat. He was also unfailingly charming and friendly, with a winningly self-deprecating sense of humor, which made others willing to help him. It was in the process of researching and writing his senior thesis that Jack began to form the basis of the political worldview he would hold all his life. In his last year at Harvard, Jack shifted dramatically from the isolationist position that his father and older brother Joe clung to staunchly. Convinced that they were wrong, Jack now aligned with Franklin Roosevelt in the belief that the United States had a duty to intervene in defense of Europe's beleaguered democracies and occupied states. Jack's political and intellectual differences with his father should not suggest that any particular strain was added to their relationship. In fact, while the two disagreed constantly about politics throughout the rest of their lives together, it never seemed to affect the love and mutual respect between them. By the summer and early fall of 1940, the American isolationist position on the war had begun to shift noticeably, and the first few thousand young men were drafted for military training, Jack among them. Determined to serve should the U.S. ultimately decide to enter the war, but fearful of failing the medical exam, Jack did all he could to keep himself as healthy as possible. He had begun to experience near-constant back pain in his last year at Harvard. Owing to injuries sustained playing varsity football, he began an assiduous exercise program to strengthen his back to ensure that he would be accepted for active service when his time came. Unfortunately, his physical health proved to be too problematic nonetheless. Joe Sir managed to pull some strings and procured a desk job in the Naval Intelligence Service for Jack. During the summer of 1941, Joe Jr. shocked his family with his own decision to enlist also. Though he remained as firmly isolationist as his father, that opinion was rapidly becoming a shameful and unpatriotic notion in the American consciousness. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was publicly criticized more and more frequently for his determination to keep the United States out of the war. Some biographers believe that the family's reputation was a large part of the reason that Joe Jr. voluntarily enlisted to train as a Navy pilot. No newspaper pundit was going to accuse his father or any of the Kennedys of being unpatriotic or unwilling to serve their country in the current global crisis. By 1942, both Joe Jr. and Jack would see frontline action overseas. Despite his continuously delicate health, Jack was determined to serve. While it is a virtual cliché that rich and influential men regularly pull strings to ensure that their privileged sons are not drafted into active service in times of war, Joseph Kennedy instead pulled strings to make sure that Jack was appointed to a combat position. Though it terrified him that his two elder sons insisted on venturing into the line of fire, he was nonetheless proud of them and did everything he could to ensure that they could serve honorably as they wished to do. After somehow managing to skirt a thorough medical exam, Jack was given command of a patrol torpedo boat and deployed to the Pacific Theater during the spring of 1942. Jack served with bravery and distinction. He was well liked by the men serving under him, who all described him as warm and friendly, intelligent, and highly capable. Jack's undoubted skill as a lifelong sailor and swimmer served him well during his time in the Navy, especially when disaster struck. On the night of August 1st, 1942, Patrol Torpedo Boat 109, commanded by Jack Kennedy, was one of several boats ordered to either blockade or repel the advance of 4 Japanese destroyers bound for the Solomon Islands with fresh troops and supplies. The mission was a failure, with not a single PT boat hitting their target. During the operation, PT-109 was rammed by one of the Japanese destroyers, literally cutting the boat in half. 2 of the crew were killed on impact. The other 11, including Jack, clung to the wreckage of their boat for several hours, waiting for a rescue which never came. Assuming that the crew of PT-109 had almost certainly perished, none of the other PT boats came back for them. Knowing that they would all die at sea if they continued to wait, Jack took action. He told the crew that the only chance they had was to attempt swimming to one of the nearby islands. He organized the men into a column by which the injured, unable to swim, could be towed by those who had not been hurt in the attack. Slowly and painstakingly throughout the night, Jack led his crew on a 3.5-mile swim to the nearby, uninhabited Plum Pudding Island. Though he had seriously re-injured his back during the crash, Jack told no one, continuing to swim and call encouragement to his men nonetheless. Jack saved the life of the crew's engineer who had been badly burned in the collision, towing him to shore with the strap of the engineer's life jacket clenched between his teeth. The crew of PT-109 were incredibly lucky. They were found by a civilian fisherman who carried their request for help to the nearest Allied stronghold. Jack had carved the crew's SOS message and a rough sketch of their geographic location on a coconut shell. Back home in the United States, Joe Kennedy Sr. had spent a week in agony, waiting for news. He had been told privately and confidentially about the loss of PT-109 and its missing crew. He kept it to himself, unable to bear the thought of telling his wife and family, clinging to hope that his son and his comrades might yet be found. 7 days after the crash, Jack and his crew were rescued, and the story exploded in the American newspapers. Jack was awarded a Purple Heart for injuries sustained during battle, as well as the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the highest honor awarded for that branch of the American military. Sadly, Joe Jr. was not so lucky. Joe Jr. had served ably and well as a Navy pilot, flying 25 combat missions by the summer of 1944. Though he was due to be sent home, he volunteered instead for Operations Aphrodite and Anvil, an experimental bombing program. Tragically, during the test flight, the bomber's explosives detonated prematurely, killing both Joe Jr. and his co-pilot instantly. The loss of their eldest son was a terrible blow to the entire Kennedy family, not least to Jack, who suspected that Joe had enlisted in the Navy not only for honor's sake, but also as part of his ongoing competitive rivalry with Jack. The younger Kennedys were equally grieved. Joe Jr. had always been a loving mentor and a reliable figure in his younger sisters' and brothers' lives. The blow likely fell most cruelly on Joe Sr. and Rose. The death of their first child came upon the heels of another private family tragedy. Their eldest daughter, Rosemary, had begun to regress noticeably in previous years. At 23 years of age, she still attended a convent school which could give her the kind of attention and personalized instruction she required. But by 1941 or 42, the school staff began to report an increase in frustrated and aggressive behavior in Rosemary. She became physically confrontational with those who made her angry, and she had begun to wander off without telling anyone where she was going. Fearful that Rosemary might eventually cause serious harm to others or to herself, Joe, Sir, and Rose sought medical advice on how to help their daughter. The physicians they consulted recommended a frontal lobe lobotomy, a new procedure at the time which surgeons claimed could put an end to aggressive or antisocial behavioral traits. Trusting that these doctors and surgeons were competent and believing their claims that Rosemary would be much happier and gentler after the procedure, Joe Sr. and Rose consented. The results were utterly tragic. Rosemary lost all of the progress that her mother had painstakingly helped her develop over the years. She had never attained the intellectual capacity for senior school or university study, but she had eventually learned to read and write well enough. After the surgery, she became nearly nonverbal and required constant care for her physical needs for the rest of her life. Rosemary became a shadow of her formerly sweet, loving, and excitable self. Joe Sr. and Rose were utterly devastated by the outcome of Rosemary's treatment and blamed themselves. Joseph insisted that only he should visit Rosemary in the care facility that was to be her new home. And indeed, this remained the case for years afterwards. Rose visited her daughter only once in the next 20 years, while the other Kennedy children were told nothing about what had happened to their sister. Joe Sr. would only say that she was well, that she had many friends, and enjoyed her job teaching young children with similar challenges. In an interview many years later, Eunice Kennedy revealed that she and her younger siblings were not told about Rosemary's lobotomy or resulting tragic condition for decades. Whether or not Jack knew anything about it is still unclear. The loss of Joe Jr. and Rosemary during the years of World War II were the beginning of a series of terrible tragedies which would befall the Kennedys and their descendants throughout the remainder of the 20th century. When he was discharged from active duty, Jack returned home to his family. Joe Sr., who was a close contemporary and friend of the newspaper giant, William Randolph Hearst, secured Jack a job as a journalist with Hearst newspapers. Jack traveled to San Francisco to cover the inaugural convention of the newly created United Nations. His writings from this period show that he had his doubts that the reach or effectiveness of the UN would ever be any greater than that wielded by the now obsolete League of Nations. He also saw the creation of a Security Council with broad veto powers as conferring an unfair advantage to already powerful countries, by which they might continue to dominate the rest of the world and thus negate much of the intended spirit of the institution. Jack returned to Europe in the summer of 1945 as an international correspondent covering the Potsdam Conference, where he took a similarly dim view of the proceedings, which now divided Europe into two distinct spheres of influence. It was already clear by the end of the war that the United States and the Soviet Union were locked into a trajectory of struggle for geopolitical supremacy. With the economies and infrastructure of so many other countries shattered by the war, Jack knew that only the US and Russia now had the resources or the power to shape the post-war world. After the years he had spent observing and researching the geopolitical configurations of Europe and Asia, he believed that if the world was going to avoid sliding back into brutal authoritarianism or wholesale imperialism, the United States had to embrace internationalism and support nations seeking sovereignty and development in order to keep them from turning to communism or from coming under the direct rule of the Soviet Union. Throughout his subsequent political career, Kennedy remained an avid Cold Warrior. While he was a reasonably talented writer, which he had proven with the publication of his senior thesis and regular editorials for the Harvard Crimson, Jack's real passion clearly lay elsewhere. Some biographers speculate that Jack undertook his subsequent political career mostly under pressure from Joe Sr., who was absolutely determined to see one of his children attain high political office. It does not seem that this was the case, however. Jack remained passionately interested in politics and government throughout his young life, and it seems unlikely that his father had to twist Jack's arm particularly hard, if at all, to urge him to run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Joe Sr. not only managed his son's 1947 congressional campaign, he bankrolled the entire operation, lobbied for political and media support, and promised favors and bribes to those who could help support Jack's candidacy. That being said, the campaign's platform was entirely Jack's brainchild. He may have worked closely with his father on strategy and discussed policy proposals with him and the rest of his campaign team, but ultimately, policy decisions were his alone, and he wrote all of his own speeches with the editorial help of his assistant Ted Sorensen. The whole Kennedy family contributed in some fashion to the furthering of Jack's political career throughout the following decade. Bobby co-managed Jack's campaigns for the House and Senate along with Joe Sr. His siblings Eunice, Pat, Jean, and Teddy knocked on doors and canvassed for votes. Jack's mother and sisters hosted elegant teas at Boston's most fashionable hotels to lobby hundreds of Democratic women voters on his behalf. This strategy proved a smashing success, securing the love and political loyalty of thousands of women voters. In 1947, at just 29 years old, John F. Kennedy won election to the U.S. House of Representatives, defeating Henry Cabot Lodge in the 11th District of Massachusetts. In 1948, another terrible tragedy befell the Kennedys when they received word that their daughter, Kik, was killed in a plane crash while on vacation with friends. Jack was utterly devastated. Of all his siblings, he had always been closest to Kik. She was quick and witty, like himself. She had always looked up to and admired her older brother, and he in turn trusted her implicitly. Their siblings recalled that Jack and Kik often finished each other's sentences, or were caught giggling over private jokes they shared with no one else in the family. When Kik died, Jack's friend Lem Billings recalled, "It became that much harder to reach Jack. He had never been very demonstrative with his emotions to begin with, and with his beloved sister gone, he became even more remote emotionally. While he was a loving big brother to all of his younger siblings, the increasingly close relationship he had recently developed with his brother Bobby likely provided some comfort after Kik's passing. There was such a big difference between them in age that the two brothers did not attain a real closeness until Bobby was in his early to mid-20s. Jack and Bobby became best friends when they worked together on Jack's 1947 campaign for the U.S. House of Representatives. From then on, throughout Jack's political career, Bobby would work in lockstep with his brother and their father, managing Jack's campaign for Congress, for the Senate, and eventually for the office of President of the United States, with Bobby serving as Jack's Attorney General and right-hand man. During his tenure as a member of the House and later as a senator for Massachusetts, Jack established political positions and leanings which would come to characterize his entire career. He remained an avid New Dealer in the Roosevelt mold. He voted in favor of strengthening Social Security, building more affordable housing, and establishing rent control. He tended to support pro-labor initiatives and opposed excessive tax relief for large corporations like oil companies. He was also an active advocate for American veterans and worked to improve the provision of housing and job opportunities for them. Additionally, he supported the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Historically, these positions have endeared Kennedy to liberals and progressives, many of whom continue to admire his policy record, writings, and speeches. Other scholars, however, have sought to highlight his seemingly more conservative policy positions and insist that the man himself was not nearly so progressive as his reputation implies. Indeed, Jack took a hardline stance against communism both internationally and domestically. He supported cuts to income taxes and corporate taxes to encourage growth, and he showed a certain wariness for the power of organized labor. All qualities typically associated with an American conservative perspective. Yet, Kennedy's worldview was far more nuanced. Despite his stance on communism, Kennedy was no supporter of Joseph McCarthy or of his zealots' campaign against suspected communists in the government or the military. Though McCarthy was a friend of Joe Kennedy's, Jack loathed McCarthy personally and thought him dangerous, as many of his colleagues did. But like them, also feared McCarthy's power over the increasingly anti-communist American public. Further, Jack may have supported lower taxes, free trade, and a strong dollar, but not for the primary benefit of elites or corporations, or at the expense of public programs that benefited working people. Finally, his wariness of unions had less to do with the typical conservative fear of organized labor restricting growth than with the potential for unions to hijack the power of the workers they were supposed to represent. In the final estimation, what emerges is not a flaming progressive or a firm conservative for that matter. Kennedy was a moderate, a pragmatist, and a realist. A close reading of his political speeches, his books, and his academic papers reveal a deep thinker whose policy conclusions were far more complex than the traditional left-wing or right-wing labels typically allow. He rejected the dogmatism that he saw as characteristic of both persuasions and championed an overall outlook on politics, statecraft, and citizenship, which he believed could encompass and unite all Americans and perhaps all nations. When he addressed the student body at the 50th anniversary of Choate, his alma mater, he quoted Rousseau, "As soon as any man says of the affairs of state, 'What does it matter to me?' the state may be given up as lost." He urged Choate students to resist giving into political cynicism, that American democracy could only survive and prevail if its citizens remained active, engaged, informed, and committed to a collective spirit of public service. He also called for a renewed emphasis on compromise and good faith in political and civic life, insisting that both were utterly essential for effective politics and a cohesive society. Political discourse, he said, might often be adversarial, but it should never be characterized by enmity. Despite his hard work and commitment to his constituents, Jack had the worst attendance record among those members of the 80th Congress of the United States as his lifelong struggle with illness continued to rear its ugly head. He struggled with malaria, which had remained undiagnosed during the war and which had weakened him greatly. Shortly after his election to Congress, he was finally diagnosed with Addison's disease. Jack's doctors prescribed steroids, which unfortunately complicated his enduring back injuries, contributing to the erosion of a spinal disc and leaving him nearly unable to walk. He continued to struggle with bouts of illness and terrible musculoskeletal pain for the rest of his life. Twice throughout the next 10 years, Jack's condition deteriorated to the point where he was administered the last rites of the church. Each time, he recovered, to the immense relief of his family and friends. While his ongoing health battles embittered him, he gamely maintained a sense of humor and tried hard to project confidence in himself. These experiences gave him a strong sense of fatalism. Friends and family members recalled that Jack, convinced he would not live past 45 years of age at most, was determined to push himself to achieve, to make his mark upon the world and contribute something of lasting value. By the time he began his Senate campaign, Jack was 34 years old and still an inveterate bachelor. His aides and assistants despaired over his continued messiness and lack of organization. He still sported a rather casual, even sloppy appearance with his odd socks and slightly rumpled clothes. But somehow, on Jack, the effect was seemingly rakish rather than unkempt. His tousled hair came off as boyish, and his confidence, charm, and affability seemed to help him carry it all off. Still a bachelor in every way, Jack also continued to pursue many affairs. His friends often joked among themselves about the veritable parade of women who seemed to enter and leave Jack's bedroom with the regularity of a palace guard. Women simply loved Jack. He had the ability, a former girlfriend of his noted, to make a woman feel that she had his full attention. He looked you in the eye, she said, asked you questions and showed a genuine interest in what you thought. He quickly moved on, however, if there seemed to be no possibility of sexual conquest. By the time Jack reached his 30s, Joe Sr. began urging his son to get married. If he were serious about a real future in politics, his father warned him, it was time to settle down. Public figures who remained unmarried into their 30s or 40s inevitably raised doubts about their seriousness, their maturity, or even about their sexual orientation. Jack had been in and out of love a few times since his Choate days, but never with anyone suitable, that is, unmarried and Catholic. In the spring of 1951, he met Jacqueline Lee Bouvier at a dinner party. Jackie, Teddy Kennedy recalled, had captivated Jack right away. She was beautiful. But more than this, she had far more substance and intelligence than many of the women he had dated. Jack was immediately interested and asked her if she wanted to go out for a drink with him after dinner. Unfortunately, just at that moment, Jackie's fiancé unexpectedly arrived to take her home. Jack backed off, and it was another year before the two met again at yet another dinner party. By then, Jackie had ended her engagement, and she and Jack soon began dating. She initially kept him at arm's length, a dinner date here, a movie there. While she found him handsome, charming, and quite brilliant, She doubted his commitment. Here, she later said, was a man who didn't seem to want to get married. Jack nonetheless continued to pursue her and gave every indication that he cared about her more and more. He was not the flowers and candy type, Jackie recalled, but gave her books instead. He loved to talk about literature and history with her. Though she was 12 years his junior, just 22 years old and fresh out of college, Jack found her highly intelligent and accomplished. He admired her impressive facility for languages, at which he had never excelled. Jackie spoke French with near-native fluency and was comfortable conversing in Spanish, Italian, and even German to a limited extent. In addition to being smart and beautiful, she was kind, quietly funny, and utterly loyal and devoted to those she loved. Friends of Jack's recalled that the two had bonded over their similar childhoods, in which both had escaped family pressures, clashes, and in Jack's case, debilitating illness, by turning to books and their own inner worlds. In the early spring of 1953, Jack proposed to Jackie, and she accepted. The pair were married on the 12th of September at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Though each loved and admired the other, Jack and Jackie had a difficult marriage, largely owing to Jack's virtual inability to be faithful to one woman, even his wife. For Jackie's part, her husband's many and continued affairs angered and saddened her. Yet, the concept of husbandly infidelity was such a ubiquitous part of the culture in which they had both been raised that Jackie, like Rose Kennedy and her own mother before her, learned to ignore it, asking Jack instead for his discretion, for the sake of her dignity. An additional strain on their marriage was the long hours Jack worked as a sitting senator, his still active social life aside. Jackie frequently found herself alone well into the evenings. She grew lonely and depressed in the early years of her marriage, a state compounded by the difficulty she and Jack experienced conceiving children in their first few years together. Jackie suffered a miscarriage 2 years into her marriage, and the following year, she gave birth to a stillborn child, a daughter they had planned to name Arabella. Jack wasn't even there when his wife delivered. He had gone to Europe with friends a mere month before her due date. In 1957, a year after losing Arabella, Jackie gave birth to their daughter Caroline, who was followed in 1960 by a son, John Jr. Caroline and John Jr. were the only children of Jack and Jackie Kennedy to survive to adulthood. Jackie gave birth once again during the summer of 1963 to a son named Patrick who, sadly, lived only 2 days. The stresses of their marriage no doubt made their lives together challenging. What seemed to bring them together more than anything else was Jack's ongoing health struggles. He continued to experience one or more gravely serious hospitalizations per year, and by the late 50s required multiple potentially life-threatening back surgeries just to stay mobile. Throughout Jack's periods of convalescence, no one was more devoted to him than Jackie, who rarely left his side. By the late 1950s, Jack had reached a political echelon, which few, if any, people ever reached before the age of 40. He had amassed more than a decade of experience in politics and government. He had published 2 more highly regarded books since the release of Why England Slept. In 1956, he published Profiles in Courage, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize. In 1958, he published A Nation of Immigrants in partnership with the Anti-Defamation League. In these works, as well as in his speeches in Congress or on the campaign trail, Kennedy had constructed a political ethos and a vision for his country's future, which would carry him all the way to the White House by 1960. With his brother Bobby and his wife Jackie at his side, helping to manage his campaign, and with his father Joe Sr. at his back advising and financing him, Jack hit the campaign trail in what proved to be one of the most fascinating elections in American history. The employment of media resources was unprecedented, and the election featured the nation's first-ever televised political debates. Carefully coached, naturally photogenic, and now significantly more polished thanks to the influence of his wife Jackie and her legendary sense of style, Jack Kennedy made a far more favorable impression on television than his Republican opponent Richard Nixon. Some commentators have insisted that Nixon's performance in the debate was more substantive than Kennedy's, but that his tendency to speak to the reporters and not the camera, as well as his noticeably sweaty countenance, weakened his effectiveness in the television medium. Kennedy's charisma in that first televised debate sent him rising in the polls. In the end, John F. Kennedy took 303 electoral college votes to Nixon's 219, winning him the presidency, though he secured the popular vote by less than 1% over his rival. JFK, as he has become known, was the youngest president ever elected to the White House at just 43 years old, as well as the first Catholic. Jack's presidency is a storied one in American history and popular culture. Though it lasted less than 1,000 days, rarely had so much tumultuous change been set in motion so rapidly in such a short period of time. During the scant 3 years of his presidency, Jack's administration confronted and helped overcome the gravest threat ever faced by Cold War America with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He sponsored extensive and varied legislation and laid the groundwork for broad domestic reforms, which would see their full fruition in the subsequent presidency of Lyndon Johnson. In terms of foreign policy, Kennedy adopted a multifaceted approach which mixed diplomacy with decisive action. Though a committed Cold Warrior, he believed that the U.S. could forestall the spread of communism by extending a hand to developing nations or those seeking sovereignty and independence on their own terms. Kennedy established multiple foreign aid and development organizations to achieve these aims in Africa and Latin America, including Food for Peace, the Alliance for Progress, and the Peace Corps. His early attempts to lower Cold War tensions in talks with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev over a divided Berlin were largely unsuccessful. The military buildup and nuclear arms race, which began under Eisenhower, initially accelerated under Kennedy, and neither the United States nor the Soviet Union seemed willing to be the first to begin disarmament or to allow transparency where their nuclear arsenals were concerned. The Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-backed coup of Fidel Castro's Cuba, which Kennedy's administration inherited from the Eisenhower White House, was ultimately a failure. Khrushchev responded with the installation of infrastructure for ballistic nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The ensuing Cuban Missile Crisis, during which U.S. naval forces established a blockade to prevent delivery of the missiles, was the closest the world came to a potentially devastating nuclear exchange since the end of the Second World War. To Kennedy's and Khrushchev's mutual credit, they were able to secure a diplomatic solution whereby the Soviets would remove all nuclear infrastructure from Cuba and the U.S. would dismantle their nuclear infrastructure in Turkey, where missiles were positioned for strikes on Russia. A direct telephone line was established between Kennedy and Khrushchev following this episode, and Cold War tensions began to lessen considerably. The Cuban Missile Crisis had badly shaken Kennedy and considerably altered his perspective on the Cold War, spurring him to change tactics and pursue the first nuclear test ban treaty with Soviet Russia. One area of Cold War competition which would be allowed to continue was the newly formed NASA and its Apollo program. Though he would not live to see Neil Armstrong walk on the moon, one of the things Kennedy is most remembered for is laying the groundwork and instilling the confidence in the American people to launch a new age of space exploration. Historians are divided on Kennedy's domestic policy record. While some emphasize his failure to enact a majority of his New Frontier agenda items during his 3-year stint in the White House, Others point out that those proposals that did not achieve passage during Kennedy's tenure were subsequently passed during Johnson's presidency. Still, an impressive amount of legislation was initiated by the Kennedy administration, including reforms in education, labor, healthcare, social welfare, and taxation. Between 1961 and 1963, corporate taxes and income taxes across all brackets were lowered to encourage growth and consumer spending. Social Security was bolstered. Food stamps were reintroduced. Revitalization schemes were launched in economically depressed areas. The minimum wage was raised. Collective bargaining power strengthened and educational funding was increased. Social reforms also received increasingly pointed attention over time from the Kennedy White House, including civil rights. 1962 saw the establishment of the Commission on the Status of Women, which investigated and reported on women's inequality in areas such as education, employment, and political representation. One area of domestic policy in which Kennedy evolved considerably throughout his presidency was civil rights. Though he initially seemed rather non-committal to the more activist sections of the movement for black equality, such as the Freedom Riders, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Kennedy's perspective and his willingness to act grew throughout his time in the White House. His struggles with Southern segregationists who refused to integrate public universities, even under orders of the Supreme Court, as well as the horrendous violence perpetrated on peaceful protesters, such as that carried out in Selma, Alabama, spurred him to take a firmer and far more public stance against racial hatred in America. Initially nervous when he heard about the imminent march on Washington in 1963, he was instead inspired and overcome as he watched Dr. Martin Luther King give his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech on a live telecast of the rally. Immediately after the march, Jack received Dr. King and the other organizers at the White House to congratulate them and discuss their policy goals. Though Kennedy's presidency was relatively short, it left an indelible mark on the American collective consciousness. Despite the tumultuous times, many Americans remember the Kennedy presidency as a time of hope and optimism. The president was a relatively young, handsome, funny, and charismatic man with a beautiful, accomplished, and stylish wife and young children. The Kennedys were exceptionally media savvy, projecting a wholesome family atmosphere with more than a touch of glamour, which seemed to be the most salient characteristics in glossy magazine spreads and carefully edited newsreels. In fitting fashion, considering Jack's childhood fascination with the tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, the Kennedy White House was known as Camelot. Kennedy's youth, the hope for the future that he represented for so many, made the events of November 22, 1963, utterly devastating for millions of Americans. Jack and Jackie had traveled together to Dallas for talks with two fractious camps of Texas Democrats. As the president, the First Lady, and Texas Governor Nelson Connally and his wife rode through Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas in an open convertible, waving to the assembled crowds and smiling. A young veteran named Lee Harvey Oswald had quietly taken position at a window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, a rifle in hand. At approximately 12:30 p.m., Oswald fired 3 shots into the president's motorcade. Jack was struck in the back and then in the back of the head. He was rushed to a local hospital and pronounced dead by 1 o'clock that afternoon. Oswald was later arrested for Kennedy's murder, claiming that he was a patsy for others who wanted the president dead. 2 days later, while Oswald was being transferred from his jail cell to a courtroom for his arraignment, he was shot and killed by a local club owner named Jack Ruby. Lyndon Johnson, who, as vice president, had assumed the presidency upon Kennedy's death, instituted the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. The committee members concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, but these findings provided no check on the growth of conspiracy theories which persist to this day. Suppositions abound as to the so-called real killers, which have included the CIA, military defense contractors, Southern segregationists, or even his successor, Lyndon Johnson. Although subsequent committees continue to find fairly thin evidence to support the possibility of a conspiracy, the overwhelming majority of the American public continue to doubt that Kennedy's killers acted alone. Kennedy's assassination was the beginning of major disillusionment in American politics, one that has contributed ever since to the steady erosion of public trust in government. The body of John F. Kennedy lay in state for one day at the White House, and then for another at the Capitol building, where hundreds of thousands lined up for hours to pass through and pay their respects. His funeral was held on 25th of November at St. Matthew's Church in Washington, D.C., and Kennedy was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. Historian and friend of John F. Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., once noted that more than any others, 4 events defined the American experience in the 20th century: the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the death of Franklin Roosevelt, NASA's 1969 moon landing, and the assassination of JFK. Each of these events shook the American people to their core, fundamentally shifting both their national trajectory and their own sense of themselves as Americans. The story of the life of John F. Kennedy unfolded against the backdrop of the most consequential historical events in 20th century America. He was born during the Great War, came of age, and fought for his country during the Second World War, and until his life and presidency were tragically cut short, he stood at the pinnacle of power in the United States and attempted to guide his people through the hottest part of the decades-long Cold War. He died at the very beginning of a period of dramatic social and cultural change, and in many ways, it was JFK's memory and the remembrance of his stated ideals which helped to drive such change forward in the United States. To this day, he is consistently ranked in multiple polls as being among the top 10 best U.S. presidents in history. It is ironic that while so much is known about him, the real Jack remains rather shadowy. He has naturally inspired a slew of biographies, but few could be called truly comprehensive. Despite the sheer breadth of documentary evidence available, and especially considering the wealth of information which has been declassified in recent years, Jack lived an absurdly full and eventful life, despite its being cruelly cut short. Perhaps it is because Jack was so iconic, so larger than life, that a clearer picture of the man continues to elude us. But just what was it that made Kennedy so iconic and that continues to place him among the ranks of American history's greatest presidents? Was it his record as a war hero? Or his impressive intelligence and facility with words as shown in his memorable writings and inspirational speeches? Was it his undoubted charisma and magnetism? Was it partly due to the fact that his virtues were heartily extolled and his flaws and failings, which are characteristic of all people, were well concealed until long after his death? Was it the timing of his ascension to the presidency at such a uniquely dramatic period of international political and social change? Or was it perhaps simply that he was cruelly struck down at such a young age, and right at the beginning of what many believed would be a season of hope and optimism for their country? This last supposition may strike closest to the truth. For while a good deal of positive change followed JFK's presidency, the United States also went on to lose tens of thousands of young men in an expanded conflict in Vietnam under President Johnson. 4 more major assassinations of prominent figures pursuing broad political and social change occurred between 1963 and 1968, including Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Jack's own brother, Bobby Kennedy. Finally, a new conservative tide rose with the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. heralding the arrival of a backlash against the more liberal and progressive reforms of the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies. A tide that has continued to alternately rise and ebb in the decades since, and to heighten polarization with each political shift. In contrast to the largely positive view on JFK himself, his presidency and legacy, his critics point to numerous areas and decisions which could be said to mar his personal and political record. These include his decision to launch the Bay of Pigs invasion, his failure to come to a détente with Nikita Khrushchev over the division of Berlin, which ultimately resulted in the erection of the Berlin Wall, bringing into reality the most tangible realization of the Iron Curtain. This lack of a détente with the Soviet premier can also be said to have increased the likelihood of the Cuban Missile Crisis occurring, which could have brought the world to a nuclear apocalypse. As well as this, the U.S. support for the coup to oust and assassinate the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem ultimately resulted in the weakening of South Vietnam and its eventual defeat. On the domestic front, his dropping of import duties to promote international trade could be said to have weakened American industry through the proliferation of cheaper foreign imports, while his notorious affairs and extramarital liaisons undermine his image as a family man and lead to questions over his moral integrity. What do you think of John F. Kennedy? Would he be regarded with the same reverence had he not been assassinated in 1963? Or was he a flawed president and human being who was made a martyr by Lee Harvey Oswald? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.